Autism is everywhere. The spectrum is broad. And a recent report even suggests that 1 in 36 children in the United States are affected by autism. So it's no surprise because we're so far behind in understanding this dynamic that we are just getting to what it might look like. And it's highly possible that many of us have been misdiagnosed or undiagnosed or missed in our diagnosis. So here are 6 areas to think about if you believe you might be an undiagnosed autistic person. And I will talk more in the next few videos about the differentiation where I can around things like complex trauma, ADHD, high sensitivity, and things like that. I'm a licensed psychologist, and I'm so glad you're here. Okay, the first area in which you're going to see something happening for you is going to be around social and communication challenges, dynamics, etc. What does that look like? That often looks like difficulty making friends or difficulty and or keeping friends, difficulty navigating romantic relationships. Essentially, the requirements for relationship can be challenging, even if you're good at making friends and getting, being good at people, getting people to like you, which can also be a very common high masking trait, maintaining those. And it might just be that you in the friendships, not that you just can't keep them and they get rid of you in terms of friendship. It's just all kinds of dynamics there. Feeling awkward in social situations or out of place, difficulty understanding when it's, your turn to talk, or social cues or small talk being just almost painful and difficult because you're not really clear about why we're doing this, essentially, like why are we wasting our time here? Over focusing hypervigilantly on people's body language and facial expressions. I've talked a lot about both in trauma and autism, kind of hovering over yourself, trying to figure out what's happening now, what am I saying, what did I just say that's embarrassing, and then later doing the same thing. In fact, rumination is especially common among autistic women and girls, so really going back and rethinking everything. Difficulty knowing sort of like when to talk about your topic or monologuing a bit too much on your own special interest, and having special interests that are deep dives, not just typical, and those might also be around pop culture and things like, Barbies and horses. It might also be about quantum physics or certain artists. It could be or anything, collectible toys, anything, shows. And then a tendency to take things very literally and often missing the something to do with sarcasm. It's just like, wait, that was rude, or coming across as sarcastic when actually you're being direct. So at the heart, these social communication challenges that are way more than just, oh, I'm socially anxious here. Social anxiety is very common. In fact, anxiety is very common in general for autistic people, but it really manifests in kind of all the areas of your life socially. The second area is sensory sensitivities, very common. So being easily overwhelmed by loud noises and bright lights and fabrics and textures and socks and, the tags, blankets that you maybe need soft things around. It could be really anything, the exposure to not being able to handle overhead lighting and needing to really have your lighting adjusted, music, noises, anything that triggers and is invasive. Remember, the autistic brain is taking everything in all at once, as opposed to filtering things out, and so we're often getting overstimulated. Difficulty filtering out background noise. I found a lot of autistic people, and also those with ADHD, we tend to hear, but also be like, what? There can be processing issues there, but like to have the subtitles on, even when the volume is really loud on shows, for example. Having very strong aversions to foods, to textures, to smells. I've talked a lot about taste and things like that. I've talked a lot about smell being a huge rage-inducing trigger for me, much like misophonia, which is that rage that we feel when we often, hear mouth sounds, chewing, smacking, gum, things like that. Even on my videos, I know when I do that thing, people get so triggered, so I try to edit those out. But that's difficult for us at times. And then, or you can also be someone who doesn't avoid sensory issues, but with autism, you seek out sensory experiences. So we can talk more of that. But there can be a real attempt to bring those in a certain way as well. The next area is restricted interests and behaviors. And some research shows that women who present with the more female phenotype in girls may be less likely to display these restricted interests and repetitive behaviors in the same way. But essentially, you're going to find, though, these deep and narrow interests in topics and things like that. Stimming behaviors, it could be like I've talked about, whether it's stim toys or hair twirling or clearly hand flapping. It can also be, as I've talked about, rubbing your fingers on the soft part of a blanket, like you can't stop it, things like that. Difficulty really with managing how your body is. So you might rock back and forth. I just said to my daughter yesterday, I noticed that I do this a lot, like talking back and forth. So rocking, pacing, and having really a, hi Coco, come here, perfectionism to detail. There can be a hyper focus and sort of seeing things all at once and focusing on the narrow and deep, but also you might have that touch of ADHD and not have that part. But for today's video, we're presuming it's just a straight autistic, sort of like undiagnosed presentation, but I do know there's lots of overlap with ADHD, okay? The next area is difficulty with executive functioning. So problems with organizing, time management, prioritizing tasks, transitions, switching between tasks. So it's like now you're supposed to get off your phone and go take a shower, but that goes on for an hour, or you're supposed to switch to another activity. I think with kids a lot of times who have neurodivergence, it's like, okay, now it's time to get in the car. Changing activities can be inherently triggering and also often need a lot of preparation. Like nobody wants to have that sprung on them in general, but more neurodivergent brains are going to often need more time between transitions. There's often this mismatch too, if you're high masking, between how you present with your high functioning, or not high functioning, I should say, your executive functioning. We don't love the words high functioning, but I mean that, in other words, you look like you've got all the boxes checked, you're good. But what people don't see is that maybe you're going to your job every day, but your house is a mess. You have dishes are in the sink for a while. You don't do your laundry. There's massive piles of laundry hidden away. You struggle to pay your bills, your taxes, but at work you do all the things, right? So it's this mismatch between skill set and what it looks like we should be doing that we're often hiding. And I would add, there's often a lot of shame attached to that. So we can see massive procrastination, planning, breaking down projects. And if you have that skill where you can basically procrastinate, for example, which is kind of a classic ADHD thing or attention thing often, but also autistic, and then you still get an A on the project, but you do it at the last minute, you're not really motivated to plan. And if you struggle with planning, that just gets reinforced and often becomes a lifetime pattern for you. Or you only pay your bills when the warnings come in, things like that. So you're going to have this executive function difficulty, whether it's obvious to others or not, that really impacts your life. The next area is emotional regulation issues. And so we're going to see a lot of difficulty often. People with autism will describe either being hypersensitive and empathic and or having a difficult time really knowing what they feel and then expressing that and putting words around it. They often say, like, don't ask me, what do you feel right now? We have to go through other ways or over time help them begin to identify what does emotion look and feel like in my body. A lot of intense emotions I've often talked about. I remember saying about 15 years ago, I was really struggling in my early 40s. It's like, I just feel like I overthink and overfeel everything at the volume level 10, like turning that off. And as I've shared in other videos, what's changed that a bit has been menopause, which is that whole hitting 50s and not caring. But I really do believe that the hormones are playing a role. And I'm sure there's lots of research to back that up. In fact, I know there is. But the point is that lifetime of intensity, difficulty regulating your emotions, experiencing meltdowns, overstimulation, shutting down. It could be rage responses to overstimulation. So a lot is going on there because you're often being flooded. And then, of course, high levels of often anxiety and depression. So this next category is really often what we see a lot of comorbidity in mental health issues. So you've always been described as having anxiety. You've struggled with depression or OCD. You might have an eating disorder, very common with people with autism. Very common for people with autism. Burnout, just a lot of even misdiagnoses, especially around something like borderline. If you are a woman and you've been diagnosed with borderline and you have any of the criteria of autism, please consider getting an autism screening to dive further into that area. And then lastly, just this other category where your entire life you felt like an alien, or you've been described as quirky or odd or bitchy or different. And that doesn't really match who you feel like you are, especially like I've talked about, being at work in the 90s and having my two coworkers say, she's such a bitch. And I was like shocked. Like, what? Like, I feel like because of my mom, I've been overly accommodating and nice. Come here, Coco. So really just like this being labeled in ways that may or may not match who you feel you are. Certainly thinking of yourself as highly sensitive or highly empathic, that is really important. It is not the standard dynamic that if you're not empathic, oh, you're autistic. We can see massive variations in that. So high sensitivity in general can be there. Exhaustion and depletion after social situations, very common. Needing days to recover, enjoying being alone, isolating to a certain extent. And this can be both for autism and trauma, but you often can only feel like relaxed and safe in your body when you're alone. It might also be, if you're autistic, it's not even like a trauma response, like that can also be, but that you can, be your quirky self and dance around the house, and you don't have to watch what you're saying or doing or how you're singing things out loud, or diving into your special interests that no one else understands. Having a strong sense of justice and being a rule follower is definitely part of it for many autistic people. It's like, that's not how you're supposed to do things. Like, there's a script, and we know things like scripting and rehearsing can be very common for those with autism, especially going into social situations. Difficulty with routines and changing things. So really needing your world to be, I would say routine can be very, very strong for us. That we feel our most regulated selves when we do things a certain way. Like I've talked about, I get up, I have an exact order in which I take my animals out, in which I light candles and light my fireplace, which is a fake fireplace, make my coffee. No overhead light is ever turned on. In fact, none at all. So all of that, it might be the way that you go to work or the way that you do, projects, but that clinging to routine, like once again, if you don't have ADHD, which can sabotage that because the ADHD brain loves novelty, but essentially the routines give you a sense of peace and a way to regulate. So all of these things can be impacted because when you've been taught to be a certain way to fit in, you might be masking and not even knowing that you do things a certain way, but you really began doing them to minimize the dysregulation, harm, or trauma, or whatever, or rejection that you felt as a child. So this is a good place to start. If you think you might be autistic, please go to embraceautism.com. Consider, researching and watching autistic creators. The research is quite far behind, but I love a website called autism.org. They have really great webinars by experts in the field. In fact, many of those are things I share that I've learned here. And they often link many research articles and books and things like that. So remember that we'll talk more about how trauma is extremely common for autistic people. In fact, it can be really hard to pull it apart and separate it. But there are some things that are more classically trauma related that aren't autism. And we'll talk more about that in the next few videos. So I hope this was helpful in helping you begin to identify, because as we're going on this journey on my Sage sessions here, I'm going to keep bringing in topics like autism and ADHD, but it's important to understand when we're talking about treatments and interventions and options to understand yourself more, to remove those labels, not to say you're autistic, you're depressed, you're traumatized. But to me, it's been very freeing and given us the pathway for things like accommodations, for self-compassion, for sort of reordering your life, and to stop carrying often the shame we feel as a result of like, why have I been judged that way? Or why do I feel this way? Or why am I someone who at times can feel lonely, but has just felt deeply alone in who I am my whole life? What does that really look like and mean? And where is something like taking care of that need good for me? And where might it, for example, be actually increasing my difficulty and challenges? So that is it for today's video. I had sleeping teenagers who went to homecoming last night, so I was trying to be more quiet. But thank you so much for being here. Please take good care of yourselves, and I will see you tomorrow. All right, have a good day.